I never imagined that a quiet Sunday morning at church could spiral into the kind of devastation that would linger in my mind for weeks, the kind of humiliation that leaves a scar deeper than any visible wound, the kind that shakes your sense of self to the core and makes you question every decision you've ever made about your family, your life, and your worth. And yet, that was exactly what happened the moment my father-in-law, a man whose presence had always loomed over my life like a dark cloud I could never escape, decided to make me the center of his amusement in front of everyone, from my wife Emily and our children, who sat there with expressions I could barely interpret, shock, embarrassment, confusion, to the congregation of people I had respected for decades, friends, neighbors, and even the pastor who had known me since I was a boy, all of whom suddenly became witnesses to my unraveling dignity. And it all began so innocently, at least on the surface, with the soft, sacred hum of the organ filling the church, sunlight spilling through stained glass windows, and the scent of polished pews mingling with the faint aroma of flowers. A Sunday ritual I had always cherished for its calm, for the sense of stability it offered. Yet on that morning, nothing felt safe, nothing felt familiar, because the man I had tried for years to win approval from leaned over as if it were the most casual thing in the world and whispered words so sharp, so intentionally cutting, that I could feel them tearing through me, as if he had reached inside my chest and pried out every ounce of pride I had carefully built over a lifetime, mocking the way I dressed, my worn suit that was not designer but clean and respectable, my modest job that had sustained my family and allowed us to live with comfort, even the way I pronounced words, the very cadence of my speech that had once passed unnoticed, now became fodder for his amusement, and the laughter that followed was like a chorus of knives slicing through my confidence, echoing in the hallowed space, bouncing off walls that had always symbolized faith, peace, and community, turning them into a theater of my shame. And I could feel my chest tighten, my hands tremble, my throat constrict as if the air itself had thickened around me. Every attempt to respond with a smile, a polite nod, or even a light-hearted remark failing utterly as the venom in his tone made any pretense impossible, leaving me frozen in the pew, trapped by the weight of his derision and the gaze of people who, for just a moment, looked at me not as Richard, the husband, the father, the provider, but as an object of ridicule. And as I sank lower into the wooden seat, trying to make myself small to disappear beneath the shame, a storm of emotions raged within me: anger, disbelief, hurt, humiliation, and a strange, growing sense of determination, all clashing in a way I had never experienced before, because in that instant, I realized that this was no ordinary criticism, no simple joke told at my expense. This was a calculated display of power, a demonstration that in his eyes, I would never be enough, I would never be worthy, I would always be beneath him. And for a man who had spent decades trying to prove himself, trying to earn respect in a world that often overlooked the quiet, honest, hard-working types, it was devastating. But buried beneath the initial shock was a flicker of something else, a spark that refused to be extinguished, the realization that if I allowed this moment to define me, I would be lost forever. And as I left the church that day, my stomach knotted, my heart heavy, and my mind racing, I felt a determination so fierce that it frightened me, a burning desire to reclaim the dignity, the honor, and the respect that had been so cruelly ripped from me in front of my own family, because I had always believed that family was sacred, that love and respect were mutual currencies exchanged in trust, not wielded as weapons to humiliate and dominate. And yet that morning, in the sunlit pews of a place that should have been sanctuary, I was forced to confront the painful truth that some people care only for power, for control, for the thrill of seeing others squirm under the weight of their superiority. And in that moment, I understood that the humiliation was not just an isolated incident, but a reflection of decades of subtle judgments, snide remarks, and covert tests designed to keep me in my place. And though I wanted to collapse, to cry, to scream, I held it all inside, feeling a strange mix of rage and clarity, because deep down, I knew that what had begun as the worst day of my life was also the beginning of a journey I had no choice but to embark upon. A journey that would force me to examine every relationship, every assumption I had about loyalty and love, every ounce of courage I possessed, because the events of that Sunday were merely the first page of a story that would ultimately change everything. My pride, my family, the power dynamics within the people I had thought I knew, and even the fortune that lay hidden in the shadows of that household, a fortune that, until that moment, I had barely dared to consider could be mine to influence. And as I walked out of the church doors into the crisp morning air, the sunlight now glaringly harsh on my face, I felt a quiet but unrelenting determination settle over me, a vow that I would never allow such humiliation to define the rest of my life, that I would rise, strategically, patiently, and with a purpose so sharp it could cut through even the thickest walls of arrogance my father-in-law had built around himself. And in that vow, amidst the mixture of anger, fear, and resolve, I felt the first real taste of the power I would need to reclaim everything that had been stripped away from me, and maybe, just maybe, teach the man who had humiliated me a lesson in respect he would never forget. After that Sunday, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in church, and it wasn't just the words themselves, or the mocking tone that had cut me like glass. It was the sheer audacity of it. The way my father-in-law had turned a sacred, peaceful place into a stage for my degradation. And as I sat alone in my study that evening, the shadows from the dim lamp stretching long across the walls, I found myself replaying every second over and over, each laugh, each sneer, each subtle yet unmistakable gesture of condescension, and it felt as though I were trapped in a slow-motion replay of my own disgrace, the sound of his laughter echoing in my ears like some cruel anthem composed solely to remind me of my inferiority. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the humiliation didn't start that morning in church. It had been creeping into my life for decades, hidden behind polite smiles, gracious advice, and small acts of concern that, in retrospect, were always designed to remind me of my place, to reinforce a hierarchy I hadn't even realized existed. And suddenly, the countless family dinners, the awkward conversations at holidays, the subtle digs about my job, my salary, my appearance, the way I spoke, how I carried myself, all of it connected into one intricate pattern, one that painted a picture of a man who had never seen me as an equal, a man who had invested years in making sure I always felt just a little less, a little smaller, little unworthy in the eyes of the family he claimed to love. And that realization hit me harder than any single insult could have, because it meant that the entire foundation of our relationship had been built not on trust, not on mutual respect, not on love, but on control, manipulation, and the relentless exertion of power over someone he considered beneath him. And the betrayal I felt was almost unbearable, a deep, twisting, gnawing sensation that settled in my chest and refused to leave. Combination of shock, sorrow, and a cold, hard anger that I had never allowed myself to feel so intensely before. And it was made worse by the way Emily reacted, caught somewhere between defending me and placating her father, her eyes wide, her mouth trembling as though she wanted to intervene but feared the consequences. And seeing her torn like that made the pain sharper, because I knew she loved me. I knew she wanted to protect me, but the power dynamics at play were far greater than I had imagined, and for the first time, I truly understood the weight of being someone who is underestimated, dismissed, and mocked in the very circles where you are supposed to feel safe, loved, and recognized. And I began to question everything. Every decision I had made in the family, every choice I had made to stay, to endure, to hope that one day he would respect me, and even the quiet acceptance I had clung to for so long as a way to keep the peace. And I realized that all those small concessions, those attempts to navigate his mood and win his approval, had only fed into a system where he thrived on my discomfort, where he gained a sense of superiority at my expense. And suddenly, the notion of love and family felt tainted, because while my wife was on my side, while our children loved me unconditionally, there was a presence in our lives, a patriarch who had made it clear that his opinion alone dictated what mattered, and that any attempt to rise above his judgment would be met with derision, mockery, and, as I had learned that morning, public humiliation. And I felt trapped, suffocated by the invisible chains of his authority, by the fear that the rest of my life would be defined not by my own achievements or character, but by the way he chose to view me. And I wondered, with a mixture of disbelief and growing rage, if he had ever truly liked me, if there had ever been a moment in all these years where I was more than a source of amusement, a target for his ego, a man to be kept small so that he could feel tall. And the thought was bitter, almost corrosive, because it meant that my attempts to connect, to impress, to prove myself, had been not just futile but part of a carefully maintained imbalance, a system in which he held all the cards and I was left scrambling for scraps. And the more I reflected on his words, the sharper the images became, each memory of a small slight, each pointed joke, each casual insult now coming into focus as evidence of a lifelong pattern of control, dominance, and subtle cruelty, and I felt a fire ignite within me, a determination to no longer be the passive player in a game designed to humiliate me. A resolve that grew stronger each time I closed my eyes and heard that laugh again, felt that sneer, saw the expressions on the faces of people I respected as they watched me shrink in the pew, and that fire quickly evolved into a plan, a seed of strategy that whispered to me in moments of clarity, reminding me that there was one way to change the power dynamics entirely, one way to reclaim my life, my dignity, and my rightful place in the family. And as I sat there long into the night, drinking strong coffee to keep my mind alert, making notes in the margins of old journals I had kept to family interactions, the small conversations, the invitations, the dismissals, the times I had tried to reason or joke along with him, all of it feeding into a mental map of his behaviors, his likes, his dislikes, and his weaknesses, I began to realize that there was one place where his control might be vulnerable, one domain he could not completely guard without attracting attention or suspicion. And that was his will, the legal document that outlined his possessions, his fortune, and the power he wielded within the family. And suddenly, the humiliation I had endured for decades, the mockery that had felt like a cruel, unending storm began to take on a new shape, a shape that offered not just an outlet for revenge, but a way to reclaim respect, to shift the balance of power in a manner so precise, so calculated, that the man who had reduced me to embarrassment would be forced to acknowledge my worth in a way that could not be ignored, denied, or dismissed. And that thought alone, the notion that there existed a lever I could pull, a path I could take to not only restore what had been lost but to rise beyond it, filled me with a combination of excitement, fear, and resolve that coursed through my veins with the intensity of a storm I had been waiting my whole life to unleash. And as I finally leaned back in my chair, exhausted but alive with purpose, I understood that this was not just about revenge, not just about pride. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming my narrative, my dignity, and my place in the family. And I vowed to myself that I would not rest. I would not falter. I would not allow the shame, the betrayal, and the humiliation to define the rest of my days, because I had glimpsed the opportunity to turn the tables. And once I did, the life I had endured in silence would transform into a life of control, recognition, and ultimately triumph. And it was that vision, clearer than any sermon, more compelling than any advice, more tangible than any fear, that kept me awake through the night, planning, observing, and preparing for the moment when my father-in-law would finally see me not as a man to ridicule, but as a force to be reckoned with, a man whose dignity, once stripped, would be fully restored and whose family would stand firmly by his side, never again allowing the shadow of mockery or judgment to cloud the respect that was rightfully his. Emily and I had been married for 25 years, and during all that time, I had walked the long, echoing halls of her father's sprawling estate countless times, often without thinking much beyond polite conversation, passing under the grand archways and brushing my fingers against the polished mahogany of door frames, observing the ornate chandeliers that hung like frozen waterfalls of crystal from ceilings so high I had to tilt my head far back to see the last glimmer of light. And while I had always admired the beauty, the history, and the sheer opulence of the place, I never truly understood what lay beneath the surface, what currents of power and secrecy flowed quietly behind the velvet drapes, behind the walls adorned with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow every step I took, and whose presence, though silent, reminded me of the weight of legacy, the invisible chains of expectation and influence that were woven into every corner of the house. It wasn't until that moment in the aftermath of the humiliation in church that I started to see the mansion not merely as a home, but as a chessboard, one carefully arranged for the sole purpose of exerting control over everyone who lived within or came near it. And I began noticing things I had never truly paid attention to before. The way the staff moved quietly, almost reverently, around my father-in-law, how whispers traveled down corridors as if messages themselves were carrying secrets. The way doors seemed to be locked more carefully in certain areas, how certain portraits had subtle indicators of who held the favor of the patriarch and who had been quietly sidelined over the years. And the more I observed, the more I realized that this place, this magnificent house with its antique furniture, gilded mirrors, Persian rugs, and shelves of leather-bound books, was not simply a residence but a carefully curated kingdom, with my father-in-law as the undisputed ruler, a man who had spent decades crafting a web of influence, leverage, and silent intimidation that ensured everyone knew their place, and that even after all these years, I had only scratched the surface of understanding just how deep and precise his control went. And it was in that realization that I began to notice the threads of opportunity, the subtle ways in which a careful observer could gather knowledge, could find leverage, could identify openings that might allow someone like me, someone he had always dismissed, someone he had humiliated publicly and privately, to finally shift the balance of power, not recklessly or impulsively, but strategically, thoughtfully, and with the ultimate goal of fairness and reclamation of dignity, because the humiliation I had endured was no longer something I could simply endure. It had become fuel, a reminder that power, respect, and recognition were things that could be seized if you understood the rules of the game and had the patience to watch and wait. And the rumors which had floated quietly through the staff for years but which I had dismissed in the past as idle chatter, suddenly took on a much sharper edge, whispers of a new will, the kind that could redistribute the vast holdings of the estate, properties that spanned miles, investments that touched every aspect of the family's business dealings, control over companies that had been built from the ground up over generations, and the knowledge that my father-in-law's health was fragile, that he was no longer the unshakable titan he had been in his prime, filled me with a mix of cautious excitement and strategic caution, because this was a man who could sense weakness from miles away, who had built his empire on careful observation and manipulation, and who would not tolerate clumsy or reckless moves. And I knew that any attempt to seize an opportunity would have to be calculated, precise, and deliberate, every step measured, every interaction designed to reveal or test him subtly, without raising alarms. And I started thinking in ways I had never thought before, analyzing conversations, noting habits, observing interactions, mentally cataloging strengths, weaknesses, tendencies, and the small inconsistencies that could be leveraged. And the humiliation I had endured in church that morning, which had felt like a crushing blow, now began to morph in my mind into a challenge, a puzzle that needed solving, a test of patience, intelligence, and courage, because if I could navigate the complex world of manipulation, deceit, and power games my father-in-law had spent decades constructing, I could not only protect my family and restore my dignity, but also potentially secure a position of influence, authority, and recognition that I had been denied for my entire adult life. And I realized that this was not a quest for petty revenge, but a mission of justice, a way to right the wrongs that had accumulated quietly, invisibly, in the undercurrent of family dynamics for decades, because fairness was something I craved, recognition something I deserved, and the restoration of dignity something I would no longer allow to be withheld. And as I walked slowly through the rooms of the mansion that evening, observing the way the fading light glinted off the crystal chandeliers, the way shadows pooled in corners, the quiet steps of staff moving through corridors with practiced grace, the scent of polished wood and old leather mingling with the faint aroma of a fire burning low in the grand fireplace, I began to see the estate for what it truly was, not merely a home or a symbol of wealth, but a living organism, a network of influence, history, and control that could be understood, navigated, and, if handled wisely, leveraged to my advantage. And for the first time, the idea of confronting him directly or exposing his methods felt less intimidating, because knowledge, I realized, was the true weapon, the ultimate equalizer. And the more I observed, the more I understood that patience, subtlety, and careful planning would be my allies, and that the mansion itself, with all its grandeur, history, and secrets, was not just a place where my humiliation had occurred, but a landscape rich with opportunity, a map to the future I could shape, a future in which the man who had belittled me, dismissed me, and mocked me in church would no longer hold the absolute power he had long exercised over my life. And in that realization, as I paused before a portrait of my father-in-law as a young man, his eyes staring out with the same intensity he wielded today, I felt the first stirrings of hope mixed with strategy, a flicker of determination that would grow into something unstoppable, because I understood that if I played my cards right, if I observed, learned, and acted with precision, I could reclaim not just respect and dignity for myself, but security, influence, and recognition for my family. And the notion of justice, long delayed, long denied, suddenly felt within reach, a tangible goal born from the secrets that lay hidden behind the walls, under the floors, and in the whispered conversations of staff who had observed, endured, and carried knowledge for decades. And I vowed to myself that every corner of this mansion, every shadow, every whispered secret, every hint of the old man's intentions would be studied, catalogued, and understood, because I was no longer the man who could be humiliated and dismissed. I was becoming the man who could see the game in its entirety, who could navigate its dangers, and who could, with patience, skill, and courage, turn the tables in a way that was subtle, strategic, and entirely inevitable, and that thought alone, the recognition of opportunity hidden in plain sight, gave me a clarity I had never felt before. A sense that the humiliation I had suffered was not the end of my story but the beginning of a plan, a journey, and a reckoning that would eventually shift the balance of power in a family that had always placed me below its pedestal. And as I closed my eyes that night, listening to the quiet creaks of the old mansion settling around me, I realized that every step, every observation, every careful note I made would be a thread in a tapestry that, when completed, would ensure not just fairness and justice, but a restoration of dignity, influence, and respect that had been denied to me for far too long. And I felt a mix of exhilaration and focus, knowing that the path ahead would be difficult, that my father-in-law was formidable, calculating, and aware of everything, but that I had finally glimpsed the secret pathways, the hidden levers, the unguarded corridors that, if navigated correctly, could lead me to not only reclaim what I had lost but to rise above, strategically, deliberately, and permanently, because in the shadows of the mansion walls lay not just wealth and influence, but the opportunity to finally, definitively, secure my place in a family and a legacy that had long felt just out of reach. And with that realization, I felt the first true sense of control, purpose, and hope I had experienced in decades, and for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future in which the humiliation of that Sunday, and every slight that had come before, would be nothing more than a memory, a lesson, and a prelude to the life I was now determined to claim. Once the sting of that Sunday settled into something colder and more focused, I began to see my father-in-law not as an immovable force but as a man made of habits, routines, preferences, and blind spots, and I realized that if I wanted to reclaim my dignity and secure a future where my family would never again sit silently while I was belittled, I had to stop reacting emotionally and start observing intelligently. So I slowed myself down and began paying attention to every little detail, every pause in his speech, every shift in his posture, every look he gave the staff when he thought no one was watching, and it was almost unsettling how quickly patterns emerged once I forced myself to watch instead of feel, because I noticed how he treated the housekeeper differently when guests were present, how his voice softened around donors and hardened around relatives he deemed weak, how he always positioned himself at the head of the table even when dinner was informal, and how he used silence as a weapon, letting it stretch just long enough to make others uncomfortable before delivering a remark that reasserted his dominance. And the more I watched, the more it felt like studying a living chessboard, where every move was intentional, every word carefully chosen not just to communicate but to control, to remind everyone in the room of who held the power. And I began making mental notes that grew more detailed with each passing day, quietly cataloging what irritated him, like when a meal was served a few minutes late or when someone challenged his memory of events, and what pleased him, like public praise, visible loyalty, and the illusion that his decisions were unquestioned. And I started asking questions in a way that seemed harmless, almost naive, posing them as curiosity rather than strategy, letting people talk while I listened, because I learned quickly that people reveal far more when they believe you are not a threat. And through these conversations I began to uncover layers of his world I had never been invited into before. His favorite charities that weren't chosen out of generosity but out of image, his disdain for certain business partners he still smiled at publicly, the lawyers he met with in quiet rooms away from the main house, and the subtle ways he tested people's loyalty before deciding whether they were worth keeping close or slowly pushing aside. And at first Emily thought I was simply being overly cautious, maybe even paranoid, asking why I suddenly paid so much attention to things I had once ignored. But I couldn't explain to her what I was seeing yet, because I didn't fully understand it myself. I only knew that knowledge was power, and power was the only way I could turn that humiliation into a future I controlled instead of endured. And as days turned into weeks, my observations became sharper, more deliberate, because I noticed how he reacted to different forms of respect, how flattery worked only when it came from certain people, how he despised desperation but rewarded quiet competence, and how his greatest fear wasn't being challenged openly but being outmaneuvered without realizing it. And that realization was like a door opening in my mind, because it told me that brute confrontation would never work, that anger would only confirm the low opinion he already held of me, but patience, subtlety, and consistency could slowly reposition me in his mental hierarchy without triggering his defenses. And I began adjusting my own behavior accordingly, speaking less but saying more when I did speak, offering solutions instead of opinions, volunteering for small responsibilities that seemed beneath him but essential to the smooth running of the household. And each time I did, I watched his reaction carefully, noting the flicker of approval he tried to hide, the brief nod that suggested recognition even if he never verbalized it, and I realized that the man who thrived on control also relied heavily on predictability, on people behaving exactly as he expected them to. And when I subtly shifted my role from passive observer to quiet contributor, it unsettled him just enough to take notice without provoking hostility, and that was when the plan truly began to take shape, not as a list of steps or some dramatic scheme, but as a gradual repositioning of myself within his world, because I started learning who he trusted and why, who he kept close out of loyalty and who he tolerated out of convenience, and I noticed that trust for him was transactional, not emotional, given to those who made his life easier or reinforced his sense of authority. And as much as that realization saddened me, it also clarified everything, because it meant that respect in his world was earned through usefulness and alignment, not kindness or family bonds, and I could work with that, I could adapt to that, and I began to see opportunities everywhere. In conversations that once bored me, in meetings I had once avoided, in responsibilities I had once shrugged off, because each small interaction was a chance to learn, to adjust, to move a single piece on the board without drawing attention, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way he spoke to me began to change, not dramatically, not warmly, but with a slight shift in tone that told me he was reassessing me, recalculating where I belonged, and that subtle shift fueled me more than any confrontation ever could, because it told me I was no longer invisible, no longer entirely dismissed, and as I absorbed every detail, every habit, every contradiction in his behavior, the plan solidified in my mind, not as an act of cruelty or revenge, but as a long overdue correction, a way to reclaim my life, my respect, and the future of my family through intelligence rather than force, through patience rather than anger. And I understood that the most effective moves would be the ones he never saw coming, the ones that felt natural, even inevitable. And as I lay awake at night replaying conversations and anticipating future interactions, I felt a strange calm settle over me, because for the first time since that humiliating Sunday, I wasn't trapped in the memory of what had been done to me. I was focused on what I was building, and I knew that every observation, every carefully chosen word, every quiet adjustment was leading me toward a moment where the balance would finally shift, where the man who had once reduced me to silence would have to see me not as someone beneath him, but as someone who understood his world well enough to navigate it on equal footing. And that knowledge, more than anger or resentment, became my driving force, because I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was planning, and in that planning, I found a sense of control and purpose I hadn't felt in years, knowing that this was only the beginning, and that each subtle move I made was laying the foundation for a future he would never see coming, until it was already set in stone. The first time I truly put my plan into action, it was so subtle that anyone observing from the outside would have thought nothing of it, that I was simply taking a greater interest in the estate or perhaps trying to be more involved in the daily life of my wife's family. But to me, every small action, every carefully chosen word, every calculated suggestion was a tiny victory, a deliberate step on a path I had long envisioned but only now had the clarity and courage to pursue. And it began with minor adjustments in the way the estate operated, offering input on small matters that my father-in-law had previously dismissed without a second thought, like the arrangement of furniture in the library, the scheduling of staff duties, or the logistics of social gatherings, little things that seemed insignificant but revealed to him that I had begun paying attention in ways I had not before, and I made sure to present each suggestion with humility, never asserting authority, never appearing ambitious, instead framing my ideas as helpful contributions. And the brilliance of this approach lay in its invisibility. He accepted them begrudgingly at first, perhaps irritated that I was noticing what he considered minor details, yet with each acceptance, I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, a subtle reclamation of agency in a world where I had once been belittled, dismissed, and ignored, and as the days passed, I gradually increased my involvement, offering to handle minor, business matters that were within my capacity, simple correspondence, review of small accounts, overseeing deliveries, tasks he might have assumed I would fumble or approach clumsily, but instead, I approached them with care, precision, and calm, and the results spoke for themselves, earning the faintest nod of approval, the slightest acknowledgement of competence, the smallest recognition that he could no longer take my ineptitude for granted. And as these moments accumulated, I sensed a shift in his perception, almost imperceptible at first. The easing of his mocking tone, the shortening of the pauses before he responded to my remarks, the way he allowed me to join conversations I had once been excluded from, where I listened carefully, contributed just enough to demonstrate insight without appearing too eager, and each time he did this, each time he allowed me a foothold in the conversations and decisions of the estate, it felt like reclaiming a piece of my life that had long been stolen, a quiet triumph that bolstered not only my resolve but also my confidence in the plan I had carefully constructed. And yet, I knew that outward appearances had to remain flawless. My emotions, my thoughts, the storm of ambition and quiet vengeance brewing beneath the surface, could never be revealed, because even the smallest hint of eagerness or resentment could alert him to the change in my strategy and reset the balance I was working so hard to adjust. And so I smiled when he cracked a joke at my expense. I nodded when he shared a minor anecdote meant to demonstrate his superiority. I laughed politely when his words carried the sting of condescension, all while inwardly cataloging each expression, each subtle indication of irritation or approval, storing them away for later when they could be leveraged in ways he could never anticipate. And I began to notice other people around him responding differently too, the staff exchanging glances that suggested they had observed the faintest cracks in his armor, the distant cousins pausing slightly when I spoke, curious as to whether my presence and decisions had shifted in importance, and even Emily began to sense a difference, though she could not yet articulate it, that quiet, almost imperceptible aura of control I was beginning to wield without confrontation or open challenge. And these subtle moves, these small but deliberate steps, were the foundation of what I knew would eventually be the ultimate shift, because I understood that patience, precision, and timing were more powerful than anger or direct confrontation, and that the most devastating victories were the ones executed so delicately that the opponent never realized they were being outmaneuvered until it was already too late to respond. And so I continued day by day, carefully observing, noting, and maneuvering, always one step ahead in my mind, always anticipating his reactions, always learning how to make the most of every tiny opening, every unguarded moment, every hint of inconsistency in his behavior. And while to the outside world, it may have seemed that I was merely adjusting to life at the mansion, becoming a more attentive son-in-law, a more considerate participant in family matters, I knew the truth. Each nod of approval, each small acknowledgement of my competence, was a silent victory, a subtle reclamation of power that had been denied to me for decades. And as I continued to play this quiet game of observation, adaptation, and incremental influence, I felt a sense of satisfaction that was sharper and sweeter than any outward expression of triumph could have been, because I was no longer the man humiliated in church, no longer the one whose presence could be mocked and dismissed at will, but someone who had begun to shift the unseen scales of respect and influence, someone who had learned the art of subtle retaliation, and who understood that the greatest power often lies not in dramatic gestures but in the invisible, patient, and precise manipulation of perception, opportunity, and timing. And in that knowledge, I found not only the confidence to continue but the excitement to see just how far I could take it, knowing that with each careful move, each calculated smile, each small but deliberate demonstration of competence, I was laying the groundwork for a moment that would ultimately change everything, a moment when all the humiliation, all the mockery, and all the silent frustrations of a lifetime could be transformed into recognition, respect, and the quiet, undeniable assertion of the place in the family and in the world that I had always deserved. And I felt a sense of calm control for the first time in years, because I understood that the plan was working, that the subtle retaliation was effective, and that the journey I had begun in that church pew, in the echo of laughter that had once broken me, was now moving steadily toward its inevitable, transformative conclusion. All while I kept my true feelings hidden, my mind sharp, and my patience unbroken. fully aware that one misstep, one visible lapse in composure, could undo everything, but confident that my careful, deliberate, and strategic moves were preparing me for the day when the ultimate shift would occur, when the man who had humiliated me would finally recognize not only my worth but the unassailable truth that I was no longer someone to be dismissed, mocked, or overlooked, and that every small victory, every subtle adjustment, every carefully measured action was part of a meticulous orchestration that, if executed with precision, would change everything forever. It was on a rainy afternoon, one of those days when the gray clouds hung low and the steady drumming of rain against the windows seemed to slow time itself, when the mansion felt emptier than usual, the echoes of footsteps in the long halls fading into soft, distant murmurs, and the staff were all occupied with errands, deliveries, or mundane chores that kept them away from the areas I intended to explore, and I realized that the moment I had been waiting for, a moment that had grown clearer and more tangible with every observation, every subtle move, every carefully calculated interaction, had arrived, and I approached it with a mixture of nerves, adrenaline, and the quiet satisfaction of meticulous preparation, because I had spent weeks learning the layout of the estate, noting the locations where important documents might be stored, listening carefully to passing conversations, remembering offhand remarks made by my father-in-law about where certain papers were kept, and weaving together the fragments of knowledge that others dismissed as trivial yet powerful, because information, I knew, was the ultimate leverage in a world built on control, manipulation, and subtle domination. And so when I asked Emily to fetch a folder of old family records for what I claimed was a history project, I did so knowing that the request would appear innocent, mundane, even charming, and she, trusting me completely and unaware of my deeper motives, complied without hesitation, glancing briefly at my father-in-law's study and perhaps sensing nothing out of the ordinary, because nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary until you knew where to look. And as I moved toward the study alone, my pulse quickened, each step echoing slightly in the polished wood floors, the air heavy with the scent of rain, old books, polished furniture, and the faint undertone of leather and wax that always seemed to linger in the room where my father-in-law conducted his affairs, and I felt the weight of the moment, the gravity of what I was about to discover, because I had long suspected that the key to shifting the balance of power in my favor lay hidden somewhere within these walls, carefully guarded, perhaps intentionally concealed, and yet, through careful observation and a little luck, I had deduced where it would be, behind a false panel in the corner of the study, a panel that blended seamlessly with the woodwork, invisible unless you knew exactly where to press, and as I found the latch, the subtle click of its release echoing in the quiet room, a thrill surged through me, almost like electricity, because I knew that behind this panel lay the culmination of years of secrecy, planning, and family maneuvering, and as I gently slid it open, the hidden compartment revealed a thick folder, its weight immediately significant, a stack of papers dense with legal language, signatures, amendments, and notations that whispered of power, legacy, and influence, and my hands trembled slightly as I lifted it, feeling the texture of the paper, the embossed seals, the unmistakable authority of a legal document that had the capacity to reshape not only our family's future but also my own place within it. And as I flipped through the pages, scanning the contents, a surge of disbelief and elation coursed through me, because here it was, the key to leveling the playing field, the tool that could ensure the humiliation I had endured for decades, from whispered remarks to the public shaming in church, would no longer dictate my life, would no longer allow anyone, no matter how powerful, to keep me diminished, silent, or invisible. And as I reached the more recent drafts, one document in particular stood out, clearly marked with dates and revisions that confirmed it was the latest iteration. And as I examined its contents, I felt a mixture of shock, disbelief, and cautious triumph, because it granted me authority over major assets, control over investments, and properties that I had long assumed were permanently out of reach, and included provisions that placed me in a position of respect and influence in ways I had never imagined, a future that seemed almost impossible considering the way I had been treated for so long, the way my father-in-law had ridiculed and dismissed me, the way he had openly mocked my contributions and abilities, the way he had maintained his control through subtle intimidation, manipulation, and public displays of superiority. And yet here it was, on these pages, a roadmap to a reality where that control could shift, where the balance of power could tilt in my favor if I acted wisely, patiently, and strategically, because I understood, with a clarity sharpened by years of careful observation, that one wrong move, one careless action, and the entire plan could collapse, all the leverage could be lost, all the progress I had painstakingly built could vanish in an instant. And so I sat there, in that quiet study rain, tapping against the windows like a heartbeat, my mind racing yet focused, absorbing every line, every clause, every legal nuance, understanding not only the opportunities but the responsibilities that came with them. And as I traced the signatures, noting the small differences in ink, the minor corrections and amendments that revealed a timeline of decisions and intentions, I felt as if I were holding destiny itself in my hands. A destiny that had been waiting for me to recognize it, to claim it, to step into a role that had been quietly prepared yet hidden until now. And the thought filled me with a sense of awe, tempered with the caution born of years of being underestimated, ignored, and belittled, because I knew that the revelation of this will was not just a victory. It was a test, a responsibility, a catalyst that could either solidify the future I had long dreamed of or destroy it if mishandled. And I felt the gravity of every choice ahead pressing against me, the weight of legacy, family expectations, and the fragile balance of power converging in that single moment. Yet beneath it all, beneath the nerves, the caution, and the fear, there was a spark, a surge of purpose, because for the first time, I held the tangible instrument that could transform my humiliation into empowerment, my invisibility into influence, and my years of silent endurance into the respect and authority I had long deserved. And I knew, even as my heart pounded and my hands gripped the folder tightly, that this was the turning point, the moment where all the patient observation, subtle maneuvering, and careful planning converged into opportunity. A chance to not only secure my family's future but to redefine my place in it. And as I carefully replaced the false panel, ensuring no sign of my discovery remained, I felt a mixture of triumph, focus, and anticipation, because holding that will was more than holding legal papers. It was holding a future that had been quietly waiting. For me, a future I was now ready to claim. A future that promised not revenge for its own sake but restoration, justice, and the undeniable reclamation of a dignity that had been stripped from me for far too long. And in that moment, listening to the rain, feeling the quiet hum of the mansion around me, I knew that everything that had happened, the humiliation, the years of subtle disregard, the careful observations, the patient planning, had led to this, and that the true test was just beginning, because now that I knew the contents of the will, now that I held the key to reshaping the balance of power in the family, I had to move with precision, patience, and unwavering focus. For one wrong step could undo everything, but one careful, deliberate move could change everything forever. And as I sat there, breathing slowly, letting the realization sink in, I understood that in my hands rested not just paper, but destiny itself. A destiny that had been waiting quietly behind the walls of that study, patiently awaiting the moment when I, the man who had been humiliated, dismissed, and underestimated for decades, would finally rise to claim it. And with that realization came a sense of clarity, purpose, and an almost intoxicating anticipation of the steps ahead, because the will was more than a document. It was the first tangible, undeniable evidence that the future could be mine to shape, and that the long journey from humiliation to empowerment was entering its most critical, transformative phase, a phase I was prepared to navigate with all the patience, strategy, and resolve I could muster, knowing that the storm of power, control, and family politics that had long defined my life was about to meet the carefully orchestrated force I had been quietly building. And that force, fueled by observation, patience, and the undeniable truth revealed in the will, would determine the course of the next chapter of my life. A chapter where dignity, respect, and authority would finally be restored, where the man who had mocked me would have no choice but to acknowledge my worth, and where my family's future would be secured not through conflict alone, but through strategy, subtlety, and the patient execution of a plan born from years of observation and determination. All crystallized in the moment I held that folder in my hands and realized that I was no longer at the mercy of humiliation. I held the power, the knowledge, and the key to a future where I would finally be seen, respected, and acknowledged in a way that had once seemed impossible. And that realization, more than anything else, filled me with a combination of awe, satisfaction, and a quiet, burning determination to see the plan through to the very end, no matter the challenges that lay ahead. The moment to confront him had been simmering in my mind for weeks, a mixture of anticipation, careful calculation, and an awareness that any misstep could undo everything I had meticulously planned, and yet I knew that this confrontation could not be fueled by anger, resentment, or a desire to humiliate, because I had learned through careful observation that the most effective power lies not in emotional outbursts but in quiet authority, strategic patience, and the unshakable knowledge of one's own position. And so one evening, when the mansion was wrapped in the soft hush of twilight, the halls dimmed by the fading light filtering through rain-speckled windows, and the staff were occupied elsewhere, I asked him to join me in his study, casually, with the ease of someone who had done nothing out of the ordinary, presenting the folder of the will as if it had been found by chance among other papers, the weight of the legal documents hidden beneath a veneer of casual curiosity. And as he entered the room, the subtle shift in the air was almost tangible, the atmosphere charged with anticipation, because he immediately sensed something was different, something deliberate, and the intelligence behind my calm demeanor told him that this was no longer the man he had dismissed, mocked, and belittled over decades. And as he took his usual seat behind the massive oak desk, the papers lying between us like a bridge connecting the past of humiliation to the present of authority, I spoke slowly, deliberately, each word chosen not to provoke or attack, but to demonstrate clarity, understanding, and command, outlining the depth of what I had discovered, the meticulous care with which I had observed, catalogued, and learned the subtle patterns of his behavior, and the extent to which I had understood the mechanisms by which he maintained control over the estate, the staff and the family, and the will, casually revealed yet undeniable in its authority, acted as the ultimate pivot point in the conversation, because as he glanced at it, the realization struck him instantly that I had uncovered the full scope of his intentions, the extent of the provisions, the hidden layers of influence and allocation he had assumed he could conceal, and yet there was nothing he could do in that moment to reclaim the advantage, because I had approached with preparation, knowledge, and a calm certainty that left no room for his usual dominance. And as I continued speaking, outlining my understanding and my intentions, not as acts of vengeance, not as efforts to embarrass him, but as the articulation of fairness, restoration, and dignity for my family, and by extension for myself. I could see the shift in his posture, the slight tightening of his jaw, the subtle narrowing of his eyes, the momentary pause in his habitual stream of superiority, and it was then, in that instant, that I glimpsed something I had never seen before. A flicker of respect, fleeting but unmistakable, reflecting back at me from the man who had spent years treating me as beneath notice, beneath ridicule, beneath consideration. And I realized in that quiet moment that humiliation carries power only so long as we allow it to, that the mockery, the public shaming, the underestimation, only retains its hold over a person if that person accepts it as truth. And by choosing not to accept it, by quietly observing, planning, and then acting with precision and authority, I had shifted the balance, had taken control of a narrative that had long been written against me. And as the room grew quieter, the rain outside forming a steady rhythm against the windows, I could feel the weight of decades of subtle condescension, manipulation, and belittlement begin to lift, replaced by a recognition that I was no longer invisible, no longer a figure to be dismissed, but someone capable, someone aware, someone whose patience, intelligence, and strategic vision had positioned him to command respect even from the man who had once reduced me to embarrassment in front of family and peers. And as I observed his reactions, noting the fleeting micro-expressions of surprise, consideration, and reluctant acknowledgement, I realized that the ultimate power in this moment lay not in words of confrontation, but in the evidence of preparation, the quiet confidence, and the unmistakable demonstration that I had not only survived humiliation but had learned from it, adapted, and used it to secure a position that could not be ignored or undermined. And as our conversation continued, measured, deliberate, with me guiding the dialogue without aggression, subtly framing the situation to emphasize fairness and the restoration of dignity, I saw the last vestiges of his habitual arrogance give way, replaced by an awareness that the dynamics of the household, the estate, and the family would now include me as an equal, a participant whose competence, insight, and preparedness demanded recognition. And the irony of it was not lost on me, that the man who had mocked my clothes, my speech, my contributions, and my very presence in the church pew years ago was now confronted with a truth he could neither escape nor counter, a truth established not by rage or retaliation but by patience, careful observation, and the deliberate orchestration of opportunities. And as I concluded, letting the folder of the will rest between us, letting the weight of its contents speak louder than any threat, insult, or plea ever could, I felt a surge of quiet triumph, an almost imperceptible but undeniable shift in power, because he had no choice but to acknowledge that the man he had once treated as inconsequential had grown into someone not only capable of holding his own but capable of steering the future in ways that demanded respect. And in that charged, tense, and intimate study, surrounded by the familiar yet oppressive grandeur of the mansion, the realization settled in fully, deeply, that humiliation had lost its grip, that careful, deliberate strategy could overturn the most entrenched positions of dominance, and that by taking control, understanding the rules, and executing with precision, I had done what many would have thought impossible. I had transformed the trajectory of my life, reclaimed my dignity, and forced a man who had spent decades establishing superiority to acknowledge that I was no longer a lesser figure, but someone equal, capable, and deserving of the respect that had long been denied. And as I looked into his eyes, noting the mixture of surprise, consideration, and reluctant respect, I felt a sense of closure, empowerment, and vindication unlike any I had experienced before, because in that one calculated, deliberate, and patient confrontation, I had demonstrated that true power lies not in mockery or public humiliation, but in understanding strategy and the quiet, unyielding assertion of one's worth. And in that moment, I knew that everything I had endured, observed, and planned had culminated in a definitive turning point where the past humiliations no longer held sway, where respect had been quietly but irrevocably reclaimed, and where I, finally, had positioned myself not only as a participant in the family legacy, but as a force that could no longer be underestimated, ignored, or dismissed, because the careful, patient, and intelligent confrontation had exposed the truth, shifted the balance, and permanently altered the landscape of power in a way that would shape the family, the estate, and my life for years to come, leaving me with the profound understanding that strategy, patience, and the mastery of subtle influence are far more potent than any momentary anger or impulsive retaliation, and that the man who had once reduced me to humiliation in church was now compelled to see me not through the lens of derision, but as an equal, and that knowledge, that undeniable shift, was the ultimate vindication of every careful observation, every subtle move, every moment of patience that had led to this point. In the weeks following the confrontation, a subtle yet profound transformation began to ripple through the mansion, a shift that was almost imperceptible to the casual observer but deeply felt by everyone who lived and worked within those walls. And it began with Emily, who was the first to notice that her father's tone had changed, that the sharp, dismissive edge with which he had once spoken to me had softened, replaced by a cautious consideration that suggested he was re-evaluating his assumptions. And as she mentioned it in passing over breakfast one morning, the truth of it sank in more fully, because the man who had humiliated me publicly in the church pew, who had spent decades underestimating my contributions, skills, and worth, was now seeking my input, consulting me on matters that had once been his sole domain. And though he maintained his natural pride and carefully cultivated authority, there was now an acknowledgement, quiet, almost reluctant, but undeniable, that I was no longer a figure to be dismissed, a realization that had consequences not only for the dynamics of our relationship but for the entire household, as the staff, the distant relatives, and even the family friends began to sense a change, a recalibration of influence that subtly altered interactions in ways that I could feel even if I could not yet fully articulate. And I, for my part, approached this shift with careful attention, never allowing arrogance or overt triumph to seep into my behavior, because I knew that real power was maintained through competence, integrity, and patience rather than spectacle. And so I gradually assumed responsibility for decision-making across the estate, handling investments with diligence, overseeing renovations and staff coordination, and mediating minor conflicts that had previously gone unresolved. And each time I intervened, I did so with quiet authority, demonstrating that my input was not only valuable but essential, that my judgment could be trusted, and that I could influence outcomes in meaningful ways without arrogance, coercion, or cruelty. and the satisfaction of these moments was profound, because it was not the victory of dominance or revenge, but the reclamation of respect, dignity, and rightful recognition, the quiet yet powerful reversal of a dynamic that had long been skewed against me. And as I observed the subtle changes in my father-in-law's behavior, the way he would pause to consider my suggestions, the brief nods of approval, the occasional questions asked of me with genuine interest rather than perfunctory politeness, I felt a deep, almost tangible sense of validation, a confirmation that the strategy one had pursued with patience, observation, and careful calculation had achieved its intended effect. And this transformation extended beyond him, as the children, too, began to sense a change, noting with curiosity and admiration the way I now participated in discussions, guided decisions, and maintained a calm, steady presence in the family's affairs. And though they could not yet grasp the full scope of what had transpired, their trust, respect, and quiet attention reinforced the sense that the shift was real, permanent, and morally grounded, because I had not sought to humiliate, punish, or assert dominance for its own sake, but to restore balance, fairness, and a measure of justice that had long been absent. And as I navigated the complex dynamics of family, legacy, and estate management, I became acutely aware that this was not merely a tactical victory but a profound realignment of relationships, authority, and influence, where the weight of past humiliation was replaced with respect earned through competence, patience, and thoughtful action. And the mansion itself seemed to respond to this new equilibrium, the atmosphere less tense, the conversations more measured, the gestures more collaborative, and even my father-in-law, for all his pride and decades-long insistence on control, began to rely on my perspective in ways that were subtle yet deeply significant, seeking advice on investments, inviting input on charitable decisions, and occasionally asking for my opinion on matters he had previously handled unilaterally. And each of these moments reinforced the quiet satisfaction that had been building within me, the understanding that respect and authority could be reclaimed not through confrontation alone, but through careful observation, strategy, and patient execution. And as I looked across the dining table one evening, watching Emily exchange a glance with me that conveyed both recognition and pride, I realized that the transformation was not just professional or financial but deeply personal, a moral and emotional realignment that had corrected decades of imbalance, restored dignity, and secured a sense of justice that was now woven into the daily life of the family. And the knowledge of this permanence, that the shift I had orchestrated was unlikely to be undone, filled me with a profound sense of calm and accomplishment, because I understood that the humiliation that had once dominated my life, that had reduced me in the eyes of others and even my own family, had been replaced with trust, authority, and respect earned not through power plays or confrontation but through intelligence, patience, and the consistent demonstration of competence, integrity, and deliberate action. And as I continued to guide decisions, mentor staff, and influence outcomes, I felt the full weight of the transformation, the recognition that the family unit itself had realigned around fairness, balance, and mutual acknowledgement of ability, and that my own place within it was now secure, respected, and influential in ways that were both tangible and enduring. And the most satisfying realization was that this reclamation of dignity was not a temporary victory but a fundamental shift, one that ensured that the legacy of the family, the well-being of my children, and the respect for my role within both the household and the broader family estate would remain intact, protected by the careful strategy, patience, and insight that had brought me to this point. And as I reflected on the journey from the humiliation in church to the authority now quietly acknowledged throughout the mansion, I felt a profound sense of fulfillment, because I had learned that true power is subtle, influence is earned, and respect cannot be demanded, but must be demonstrated through consistent, thoughtful, and principled action, and that the balance I had achieved was more than just a shift in authority. It was a moral and emotional restoration, a permanent correction of the inequities that had long shadowed my life, and a confirmation that dignity, once lost, can be reclaimed through wisdom, strategy, and unwavering perseverance, ensuring that the lessons of the past were not forgotten but transformed into the foundation for a future where humiliation could no longer hold sway, and where respect, trust, and balance had finally become the guiding principles of the family I had fought so quietly, patiently, and deliberately to protect and elevate. Looking back on the long, arduous journey that began with a single, devastating moment of humiliation, I can now see with clarity that every sting, every sharp word, and every subtle undermining that I endured at the hands of my father-in-law was more than a mere personal affront. It was a catalyst, a brutal but necessary lesson in the intricacies of human behavior, family dynamics, and the latent power that lies dormant in patience, observation, and strategic action. And as I reflect on that Sunday in church, when his mockery was public, cruel, and calculated, I realize now that the humiliation I felt was never just about the moment itself, but about the years of subtle judgment, condescension, and the quiet erosion of confidence that had been accumulating over decades. And at first, that weight felt unbearable, as though the very ground beneath me had shifted, leaving me exposed and small in a world that demanded resilience. Yet over time, it became apparent that the key to overcoming such moments was not immediate retaliation, not impulsive anger, but the slow, deliberate reclamation of agency, the careful study of one's environment, the observation of patterns, and the patient construction of a strategy that could transform perceived weakness into undeniable strength. And in that process, I learned that revenge need not be about cruelty or malice. It could, and should, be about the restoration of dignity, the reassertion of one's worth, and the careful setting of boundaries that protect not only oneself but also those who depend on you, in my case, my wife Emily, my children, and the legacy of the family as a whole. And understanding this required a radical shift in perspective, because for years I had believed that respect was something to be granted by others, that my standing within the family, the estate, and even society was largely determined by the opinions of my father-in-law and the subtle hierarchies he enforced. Yet the revelation came, gradually, painfully, and yet powerfully, that respect is not given as a gift by those who hold power, but is earned through the consistent demonstration of intelligence, competence, integrity, and strategic action. And the realization that I had been underestimating my own capacity to effect change was both humbling and empowering, because once I began to see the rules of the game, to understand the unspoken mechanisms of influence and control that governed our family, I found within myself a strength I had not fully recognized, a reservoir of patience, observation, and calculated initiative that could be applied not to petty revenge but to the reclamation of a rightful place within the family. And as I reflect on the path that led me to discovering the hidden will, the careful observation of my father-in-law's habits, and the subtle maneuvers that gradually shifted the balance of power, I realized that each of these steps was more than a tactical choice. They were exercises in self, mastery, discipline, and resilience, teaching me that the slow accumulation of knowledge, experience, and understanding can achieve what anger and immediate confrontation never could, and that true transformation requires a combination of insight, patience, and action that is deliberate, calculated, and aligned with a moral compass that distinguishes justice from mere retaliation. And perhaps the most profound lesson of all was understanding that family, despite its inherent complexities, is not about blind loyalty, unquestioning submission, or the preservation of outdated hierarchies, but rather about the cultivation of mutual respect, understanding, and the sometimes difficult but necessary choices that ensure fairness, dignity, and recognition for every member. Because without that equilibrium, even wealth, influence, or outward appearances of power cannot prevent resentment, disconnection, or injustice. And I saw this clearly in the way the family dynamics shifted after my careful interventions, not through displays of dominance but through competence, patience, and a consistent demonstration of integrity that forced even my father-in-law, who had once publicly humiliated me, to acknowledge my worth, my influence, and my right to participate in decisions that shaped the household and the legacy. And the emotional impact of this realization was profound, because for the first time, the humiliation that had once felt permanent and insurmountable was transformed into a tool for growth, self-assertion, and moral victory, teaching me that adversity, when approached with wisdom and clarity, can reveal strengths that remain hidden in moments of pain, and that betrayal, though bitter and painful, can serve as a teacher that challenges one to develop resilience, intelligence, and the capacity to navigate complex human relationships with skill and foresight. And as I watched my children respond to the changes, the respect they displayed not out of fear but out of recognition for fairness and capability, and as I saw Emily's quiet pride in my actions, I understood that the victories achieved through strategy, patience, and ethical assertiveness were far more satisfying and enduring than any fleeting triumph gained through anger, rash action, or vindictiveness. and it became clear that the power of revenge, when guided by purpose and moral clarity, lies not in the harm inflicted on others but in the restoration of balance, dignity, and rightful authority, a lesson I could have never fully understood had I not endured the humiliation and betrayal that set me on this path. And it was in the careful orchestration of these steps, the subtle observation, the patient planning, the strategic execution, that I discovered not only the mechanisms of influence within my family but also the depths of my own courage, intelligence, and resilience. And the realization was both humbling and invigorating, because it demonstrated that even in situations where we are underestimated, ridiculed, or belittled, we retain the power to alter outcomes, reclaim authority, and assert ourselves in ways that are lasting, meaningful, and morally grounded. And as I reflect on the contrast between the man I was sitting silently in church, shrinking under the weight of my father-in-law's mockery, and the man who now participates actively in family decisions with authority, confidence, and moral clarity, I recognized that the journey was not simply about correcting past wrongs or achieving a personal victory, but about learning fundamental truths about human relationships, the nature of respect, and the ways in which dignity can be restored when approached with wisdom and patience. And perhaps the final, most important lesson is that true strength is not demonstrated through displays of dominance or the subjugation of others, but through understanding, strategic insight, emotional intelligence, and the courage to act decisively when the moment is right. And in mastering these lessons, I found not only personal vindication but the knowledge that the family, the estate, and the legacy we inherit or build are not static entities controlled by fear, intimidation, or public humiliation, but dynamic ecosystems shaped by consistent, thoughtful action, moral clarity, and the deliberate, patient exercise of influence. And in that realization lies the most profound truth. Humiliation, betrayal, and adversity are not permanent shackles but challenges that, when met with strategic patience and moral purpose, can catalyze growth, empowerment, and the restoration of dignity in ways that are enduring and transformative. And I now understand fully that the man who humiliated me in the church, who believed he had silenced and diminished me, unwittingly became the teacher who forced me to recognize the depth of my own strength, the importance of observation, the necessity of patience, and the power of carefully measured action. And that, in responding not with rash anger but with intelligence, strategic thinking, and ethical assertiveness, I not only reclaimed my dignity but also reshaped the family dynamic, secured the future for my children, and established a legacy of respect, fairness, and moral integrity that will outlast the petty humiliations of the past. And in this way, the journey from betrayal to empowerment, from humiliation to recognition, from invisibility to influence, became a profound testament to the capacity of the human spirit to rise, adapt, and triumph when guided by wisdom, patience, and an unwavering commitment to justice, fairness, and dignity. And I now face the future with my head held high, my family secure, and the knowledge that true respect cannot be stolen, forced, or demanded, but must be earned through deliberate, thoughtful, and morally grounded action, and that the lessons learned through betrayal, observation, strategy, and carefully executed revenge will remain with me, guiding me, shaping my decisions, and reminding me that even in the darkest moments of humiliation, there is a path toward empowerment, restoration, and a life defined not by the cruelty of others but by the strength, wisdom, and integrity with which we respond to it. And that Sunday in church, the man who believed he had diminished me never could have imagined that I would rise stronger, wiser, and fully prepared to claim not just respect but the rightful position, influence, and dignity that had always been mine. And in the end, that understanding, that reclamation, and that transformation is the moral I carry forward, a living testament to the fact that adversity, betrayal, and even public humiliation can, when met with patience, wisdom, and strategic action, become the greatest teachers, shaping not only who we are but the legacy we leave behind.